The events of a short 16-year span from 1930 to 1946 left an indelible mark on the planet. The worries of global depression would lead to World War II, pitting the Axis powers against the Allies. In the end, the extent of man's destructive power would be recognized with the bombing of Hiroshima. The breadlines in America could be much shorter, but the president, Herbert Hoover, can't seem to grasp the economic realities he's facing. In the very time that the world needs a huge injection of cash to stimulate the economy, Hoover begins tightening the national belt. Despite pleas from economists, he raises taxes and hikes up tariffs on imported goods. People no longer have money to spend, and European nations counter his tariff with tariffs of their own, and trade grinds to a standstill. When the Depression strikes the already embattled farmers of the Midwest, it's as if a biblical catastrophe has come over the land. Heat and drought dry up crops, and windstorms sweep over the bare land, taking the fertile soil away in great clouds of dust 10,000 feet high. The sky turns midnight black, and human activity slows to a trickle. An area covering parts of Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico changes from a breadbasket to a dust bowl. Displaced farm families called Okies take what they can carry and begin the long exodus from their dried-up lands. As portrayed in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, the journey to find new land is a difficult one, full of hardships and bitter receptions. Even as the farmers of the Depression are marching west, the veterans of the Depression are marching east to the country's capital to ask Congress for their $1,000 war service bonds early in their time of need. This so-called bonus army keeps a vigil outside Congress as the issue is debated and ultimately voted down. The congressmen are more concerned with balancing the national budget. Instead of rioting, the men sing America. The words, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty," resonating ironically through the halls of the Capitol. As the veterans form ranks and march back to their camp across the Potomac, President Hoover orders Douglas MacArthur to remove the marchers with every kindness and courtesy. But as history will bear out, MacArthur is not the man for such a diplomatic task. After donning his dress uniform, MacArthur leads his troops in attack against the unarmed bonus marchers. He pushes them across the bridge over the Potomac and burns their camp to the ground. The veterans who served their country in the Great War are routed by their nation's own army and dispersed under a shameful haze of tear gas and black smoke. The desperation of the unemployed undercuts the power of labor unions. And part of the public feels such organizations are simply un-American. Attempts at organization are met with goon squads and even police brutality. It's in this difficult time that John L. Lewis emerges as a labor leader who can stand toe-to-toe with the leaders of big business. Tired of the impotent and segregated efforts of the AFL organization, Lewis actually punches out one of his associates and leaves to found the Committee for Industrial Organization. Under this new union, Lewis galvanizes the strength of men, women, blacks, whites, and any other group without a voice. When the CIO stages strikes for better working conditions and wages, This inclusion of all people leaves big business with no one left to run their operations, forcing them back to the bargaining table. In his mercurial rise from an unknown German corporal to the Führer of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler led Germany on a vengeful conquest of the world. In 1932, the Depression is far from over, but the year marks a turning point. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected to the White House, and unlike Hoover, he listened to the pleading economists. Despite rabid fears in America of any government program that sounds like collectivism or socialism, FDR begins a courageous campaign of work programs and economic reforms, known simply as the New Deal. Government-sponsored programs like the WPA build great public works and bring a vital injection of cash back into the stalled-out economy. FDR is taking the advice of economists by running up a national deficit and spending his way out of the Depression. It slowly brings hope and money back to the people and, more importantly, begins to restore consumer confidence to buy. This jumpstart slowly turns over the great pistons of the economic engine. Work programs are working in other nations around the world, too. Ominously, Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor about the same time that FDR takes office, and his extensive public works programs are reinvigorating the German economy. Of course, unknown to the rest of the world, he's preparing for war. The Germans are angry about being reduced from a powerful empire to an impoverished people under the heavy burden of post-war reparations. After the armistice ending the Great War, one German corporal writes, "Everything went black before my eyes. I buried my aching head between the blankets and the pillow. During these nights, my hatred increased for the originators of this dastardly crime." Perhaps no one understands the power of the German people's resentment better than the young corporal who authored these words, Adolf Hitler. Hitler is serving a jail term for his part in an attempted coup in Bavaria, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. But after 4 years, he emerges from his cell with a manifesto of hate and blame, entitled Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Its themes of anti-Semitism and racial superiority make it the basis of Hitler's resurrected Socialist Party and eventually a Bible for the Nazi regime. Without laying out any concrete plans for economic reform, the mere power and vigor of Hitler's patriotic speeches plays well to the desperate masses. He gives hope and pride back to the German people, who are desperate to believe that they are in fact a proud Aryan race.
One reason Hitler made it is the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, which punished Germany unbelievably and was a treaty of vengeance by the French primarily. Secondly, it's the Depression, because between Versailles in 1919 and the Depression 1929, Germany became quite calm because economically they were doing relatively well. And then came the Depression and everything went downhill.
After 2 failed campaigns for chancellorship and a bid to share power with President von Hindenburg, Hitler is finally appointed Chancellor of Germany. His followers are ecstatic. Stormtroopers stomp down the streets with burning torches, ushering in the dawn of the new Reich and the coming of Adolf Hitler and his disciples, Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, Alfred Rosenberg, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler. Propaganda mastermind Joseph Goebbels writes in his diary, "It was almost like a dream, a fairy tale. The new Reich had been born. 14 years of work has been crowned with victory. The German Revolution has begun." Hitler wastes no time in implementing his policies. 5 hours after being sworn in as Chancellor, Hitler and Hermann Göring begin to dismantle the remains of the weak German democracy. An excited Goebbels writes, "Now it will be easy to carry on the fight. We can call on all the resources of the state. Radio and press are at our disposal. We shall stage a masterpiece of propaganda." Ironically, in the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, Jesse Owens and several black teammates beat out the Aryan Supermen, shattering Hitler's claim of Aryan superiority in front of the entire world. Hitler's influence continues to grow, and after the death of President von Hindenburg, Hitler assumes absolute control of Germany. The new Führer's first move is to take back the contested Rhineland from the French. He has only 3 battalions and limited air support, but the stronger French army is bluffed into submission. And in direct conflict with the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler arms Germany for war. In March 1938, Hitler triumphantly marches into Austria, annexing the country and welcoming it to the dawn of the Thousand-Year Reich. Crowds of excited Austrians wave Nazi flags and drop flowers at his feet.
Hitler was admired by an awful lot of people. After all, fascism was the thing to do. In 1936, Balfour, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, went to Germany and had an interview with Hitler. And he came back and published an article in the Daily Telegraph. It was just glowing. What a wonderful person Hitler is. So sincere and peace-loving.
In September of 1938, Nazi troops advance again, storming into the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. The international community is disturbed, but most leaders' fears are allayed when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain meets with Hitler in Munich. He receives assurances that Germany has no other territorial claims to make in Europe. According to Hitler, he only wants to liberate the 3.5 million Germans living in the region lost under the Treaty of Versailles. Chamberlain relents and makes his famous statement that there will not be a repeat of the Great War, but peace in our time. After the conference, Winston Churchill warns, "Do not suppose this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning." Conferring with Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini the night before meeting with Chamberlain, Hitler himself predicts that sooner or later there will be a fight with England. He does not count on any strong resistance from the democracies of Europe or America. They seem to be weak with decadence, indecision, and polluted racial strains. On September 1st, Churchill's prophecy comes true. Hitler's forces bomb Poland. His tanks and stormtroopers move in with terrifying speed, overrunning the country. After 2 days, Britain and France are forced to declare war. In November of 1936, it's become clear that the Japanese are aligning themselves with the Germans. They meet in Berlin to sign the Japanese-German Convention, which is also signed by Italy's Benito Mussolini, bringing the three Axis powers into step. Later in the same year, Japan withdraws from the London Naval Disarmament Conference, an ominous sign that it's beginning to build up its fleet of warships. The Japanese already control Manchuria, but in 1937, a border skirmish with the Chinese opens the door for a full-scale invasion of eastern China. And in Europe, the war begins in earnest. Just as in the Great War before, Hitler's forces push through Belgium and commence an attack on France. The Allies are taken back by the speed of the German advance. Within days, France is overcome. Thousands of English and French soldiers are pushed back to the sea. They're desperately evacuating from the beach at Dunkirk as waves of military and even civilian boats come to their rescue. As France falls to the Germans, Mussolini declares war, bringing Italy into the action and a share of the spoils. With a stroke of poetic vengeance, Hitler forces the French to surrender in the same boxcar used by the defeated Germans in World War I. In America, public opinion is still against the war, and with the fall of France, Britain is now utterly alone. Elated by his conquest of Poland and France, Hitler turned his attention to Great Britain. He knew that the key to taking the island nation was to crush their air force before trying to land troops on the beach. But Hitler found that this was no easy task. In August 1940, Hitler launches his Luftwaffe against Britain in an operation dubbed Day of the Eagle. It's an attempt to crush the British Air Force, paving the way to an all-out invasion. But he is sorely disappointed. As the air battles rage on for days over the skies of Britain, British pilots prove their skill, destroying the enemy fighters 2-1. The British pilots that are shot down frequently jump into a new plane, bringing the fight right back to the Germans.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Frustrated by the air war, Hitler begins to bomb London itself, hoping to break the will of the British people. Londoners are bombed and burned out of their homes, but take to the subways and cram into neighbors' apartments. Determined as ever, they go back to work in the morning. London continues to live and produce war materials.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war.
Unable to take Britain by air, the Nazis begin a U-boat campaign, torpedoing supply ships before they can reach English docks. The Fuhrer thinks he will starve out the resistance. In the meantime, FDR is pushing the Lend-Lease Act through the American Congress. Comparing America to a man who is watching his neighbor's house burn down, Roosevelt calls on his depressed country to become an arsenal of democracy. The loan of war equipment, he says, is like lending that neighbor your garden hose. He can give it back once the fire is put out. While the invasion of Britain is on hold, Hitler turns to his plans for the invasion of Russia. Despite a secret non-aggression treaty with Stalin, Hitler commences Operation Barbarossa, a land invasion designed to seize Western Russia. With a surprise attack, the German army stabs deep into Russian territory and lays siege to the city of Stalingrad. But like Napoleon before him, Hitler's troops encounter stubborn Russian resistance and bitter cold. Despite starvation and terrible house-to-house fighting, the Russians hang on to their city, eating nothing but scraps and leather. As the siege wears on into winter, the ill-equipped German ranks find themselves besieged by the freezing temperature, which kills them by the thousands. The United States was able to avoid joining the war until the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor brought the war to their doorstep. In the Pacific, the Japanese forces are meeting with greater success, occupying portions of eastern China. While not officially at war, the United States does its best to thwart the Japanese war effort with economic measures, including an oil embargo. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese decide to strike back at the United States. They launch 366 bombers and fighters from aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The Japanese planes swarm over the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii, dropping bombs that engulf the base in giant plumes of fire, leaving 2,400 dead. Most stinging are the hits on Battleship Row, like bombs dropped on the states of America itself. The Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the California. 18 ships in all. A devastating blow to the American Navy. Hitler is elated. He becomes convinced that with the Japanese at his side, he will win the war with or without American involvement. Standing before Congress, FDR declares December 7th is a day that will live in infamy and asks to declare war on Japan.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
An outraged Congress is unanimous in its approval, and so the arsenal of democracy picks up arms and wades into the fray. Buoyed by the news, Churchill issues a warning to the Japanese.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
But the Japanese advance unchecked. Under heavy attack, General Douglas MacArthur retreats from the Philippines and the island of Corregidor, but vows that he will return. It isn't until the Battle of Midway that the tide turns. Midway Island, located midway between the Aleutian Islands and Hawaii, is of strategic importance. If taken, it will provide the Japanese with a staging ground to launch attacks on the west coast of the United States. The American Navy learns of a Japanese plot to split the attention of the American fleet with simultaneous attacks on the Aleutians and Midway. Knowing that a massive Japanese armada will be waiting to pounce on a divided American convoy, Admiral Chester Nimitz decides to mobilize what is left of the battered Pacific Fleet and meet them head-to-head. With the precious aircraft carriers of both countries on the line, the stakes are high. Playing a hunch that they might catch the Japanese carriers refueling after their attack on Midway's airfield, the American carriers launch early, pressing the range of their aircraft. The first wave of American bombers streaks in at sea level, encountering heavy fire, but do not make any hits on the Japanese ships. However, they do draw the enemy fighter planes down to sea level, while dive bombers from the Enterprise scream in from high altitude, delivering direct hits. All 4 of the Japanese carriers are sunk, while the Americans lose only the carrier Yorktown. With the Japanese fleet so drastically reduced, they're now on the defensive. A massive invasion of France by Allied forces changed the tide of the European conflict. D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. By 1944, things in Germany are taking a turn for the worse. Allied planes are dropping tons of bombs on their cities, crippling industry and demoralizing the German people. The winter has hurt them badly on the Russian front, and with the spring thaw, the Red Army is fighting back with a vengeance. Safely guarded by 2 oceans, America is an untouchable production ground. A workforce composed mostly of women is supplying the Allies with endless quantities of ships, planes, guns, vehicles, even boots, anything the Allies need to keep fighting. Italy is the first Axis power to fall in 1944. But the real battle is still to come. Operation Overlord is in the planning stages. Like an epic reversal of the disastrous retreat at Dunkirk, its aim is to transport an army of 154,000 men from 12 Allied nations across the English Channel on 6,500 ships, all in a single day. They'll land on the beaches at Normandy, overwhelming the German defenses with surprise and sheer numbers. The night before the invasion, Churchill gravely muses that when he wakes in the morning, 20,000 men may be dead. Others estimate losses as high as 75,000. On the steely gray morning of June 6th, D-Day, Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, meets with the men of the 101st Airborne, scheduled to drop behind enemy lines. He tells the men, "I've done all I can." And one soldier replies, "Now quit worrying, General. We'll take care of this thing for you." As the airplanes take off towards France, the stoic general can't fight back his tears. Eisenhower scribbles a note that he keeps in his wallet in case of a disaster. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." The Allied convoy assembles at sea, and the secret invasion begins. A massive campaign of deception is also underway. Flights of aircraft drop strips of metal to convince German radar that a massive air invasion is underway at Pas-de-Calais to the north. British, Polish, and Canadian troops take their beaches with limited resistance, but the American Ranger units encounter brutal action on Omaha Beach. There are twice the number of German units predicted, laying down heavy fire. The landing craft are putting troops ashore wherever they can. Disoriented and heavily loaded, men either manage to scramble up the beach or drown in the surf. A tattered group makes it from the murderous fire on the beach to a seawall just inches tall in some places. Inspired by small acts of bravery from impromptu leaders, the Rangers pour over the seawall and advance to take out the guns on the cliffs above. The beach is secure before nightfall, and with the precious Allied foothold established at Normandy, thousands of fresh soldiers and tons of equipment pour in. The Allies gear up to take back France. The Allied army pushes through France and turns toward Berlin. With the Allies at their doorstep, the Germans mass for one last great offensive. Surging forward from their positions in Belgium, the Germans push 40 miles back into the Allied lines. Eisenhower's troops put them down in what is remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The German army is crushed, and there is little resistance as the Allies march onto Berlin. With his dreams of a thousand-year Reich crumbling around him, Hitler retreats to his bunker. On April 30th, he learns that the Americans have entered Munich and the Russians are pushing towards Berlin from the east, tearing Germany in two. For the architects of the Nazi regime, it's a dark hour of atonement. The Fuhrer decides to avoid capture the only way he can. Hitler and his bride, Eva Braun, swallow poison, and according to his wishes, Hitler is shot in the head. Goebbels arranges for the lethal injections of his children and has himself and his wife shot. On April 12th, just 18 days before the death of Adolf Hitler, Franklin Delano Roosevelt passes away in Warm Springs, Georgia. His leadership over the troops and reassurance over the American public is sorely missed. Many of the young GIs can't remember any other president before him. Just 3 hours after Roosevelt's death, Vice President Harry Truman is sworn into office and the war continues on. With Germany subdued, the Allies' attention turns to the events unfolding in the Pacific. The Marines are fighting terrible battles for the island's stepping stones that will get them within striking distance of Japan. The Japanese are outgunned and outnumbered, but they have enormous reserves of courage and determination to guard their homeland. Under Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, the man who swore he would return, Allied troops begin to recapture lost territory, including the Philippines. The crucial battles of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa bring the Allies closer to the main island of Japan, but the cost is high. The Japanese are tenacious fighters, preferring death to surrender and killing as many Allies as possible to honor their emperor. Compared to the Allied 3-to-1 ratio, the Japanese post a staggering 120 soldiers dead for every one captured. The island of Okinawa comes to the Allies at a cost of 7,613 dead and 31,800 wounded. The Japanese lose 110,000 soldiers and 475,000 civilians in this battle alone. On the main island of Japan, every soldier and civilian available is preparing to fend off an imminent invasion. Some civilians with farm tools and bamboo spears. Invading the mainland of Japan will be like Okinawa on a horrible scale. The Americans have already witnessed the deadly flights of the kamikaze pilots and the suicidal waves of civilians and soldiers charging their guns. It's the same indomitable spirit that will keep isolated Japanese soldiers fighting in the jungles of the Pacific for decades after the war is over. The Allied forces in the Pacific met a formidable foe in the Japanese army. Truman was faced with his most difficult decision, whether or not to use the power of the atom bomb. Back in the United States, President Truman has a difficult decision to make. Send the Allied men into the bloodiest battle of the war, or drop a single atomic bomb over a Japanese city to force surrender. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber, named for the pilot's mother, Enola Gay, takes off for the Japanese city of Hiroshima. When the bomber arrives over the target area above Ota River, the crew puts on welding goggles and drops a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy. At 8:15 in the morning, a terrible explosion rips through Hiroshima, sending up a great mushroom cloud 30,000 feet into the air. The blast decimates everything for miles around. The pilot later writes in his journal, "My God, what have we done?" The loss of life is incredible. 150,000 people are vaporized by the intense heat of the explosion. People and objects leave little more than shadows on nearby walls. As brutal as the death toll seems, this is only 1/3 of the number of Japanese civilians killed in action on Okinawa alone, and not a single Allied soldier has died. It's a terrible and potent demonstration of power, but the Japanese will not accept an unconditional surrender that dishonors the emperor. 3 days later, another atomic bomb is dropped on the industrial city of Nagasaki, wiping out over 50% of its population. Finally, the Japanese emperor, Hirohito, decides that Japan must surrender according to the Potsdam terms set by the Allies. The people who have fought so fiercely bow outside the palace, chanting, "Forgive us, O Emperor, our efforts are not enough." On September 2, 1945, the USS Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay. On its flagstaff, the American flag flown over the Capitol on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack.
The Supreme Commander for the Allied powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
The Japanese are astonished by MacArthur's courteous treatment of the defeated army. He calls for both sides to forget the blood and carnage of the past and to build on new foundations of faith and understanding. Emperor Hirohito signs the surrender document, ending the Second World War. After the devastation in Japan and the fall of Berlin, the whole world finally bears witness to the horrors of war and the human capacity for cruelty. In November of 1945, the Nazis responsible for war crimes and atrocities are brought before a panel of British, American, and Soviet judges. The evidence against them is overwhelming. The Reich's remaining lieutenants are convicted by their own well-kept records of the Holocaust. They're shown films of the concentration camps. Some are repentant, but Hermann Göring coldly remarks, "It was such a nice afternoon. Then they showed that awful film." Göring dies by swallowing a cyanide pill just hours before his date with the hangman. But 10 other Nazis die on the gallows in October of 1946. The Nuremberg trials, which followed the surrender of Germany, revealed the underlying evil which permeated the Third Reich. The full extent of the Third Reich's atrocities begin to surface.
My name is Magda Bass. I am a survivor of the Holocaust. 1944, when the Germans marched in, that was the first time that we heard about being taken to a work camp. We had to pack 40 pounds of personal belongings and were taken to a ghetto first. And then we were taken from there again to the railroad stations, and we got on these railroad cars to Auschwitz. We traveled 3 nights and 4 days. I don't remember any toilet facilities. I don't remember anything we ate there, because I do remember the cries of the people whose dear ones, relatives, needed help. They were dying, they were sick, they had to sit down, but it was impossible to do that. In Auschwitz, as we arrived, it was the first time that we only saw German Nazis. They separated mothers from their daughters, and they separated sisters from each other. The stench and the smell from chimneys, bright red flames, we didn't know what it is, bodies being burned on the side of the road. We had to get undressed and sit down on some very low chairs, some cubes, and they cut our hair with an old-fashioned clipper. And then in the next room, they had some way of throwing some disinfectant on us. And in the third room, they gave us 1 piece of clothing, no shoes or underwear or anything, marched us in some barracks, and the barracks had no bunk beds, just the cement floor. And as you can imagine, we fell asleep.
I come from a town called Kaunas or Kovno in Lithuania. And the Germans occupied our town about 3 days after the war broke out between Germany and the Soviet Union. And shortly after that, the Jews of the city were put into a ghetto. Every room had at least one family, some rooms had several families in them, and we didn't know what to expect. After about 3.5 years in the ghetto, the Germans were being pushed out of Russia, and they decided to evacuate those of us who were left in the ghetto. We started out, by the way, with about 45,000 people. There were about 17,000, 18,000 of us left. Men, women, just a few children. Children were killed. I was very lucky again. We were put into boxcars and taken to Germany, and we worked there. And this was not a murder camp. It was not an extermination camp. It was a labor camp. But work went on in 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never a time off, never a day off. You had to march to work for about an hour and a half. You had to stand around for a couple of hours being counted and recounted. And there was really not enough time left to sleep. We would cost absolutely nothing, and there was an unlimited labor supply. So as people died, they would bring in more every week, every 2 weeks, whatever they needed. And there was no care taken to keep people alive.
The life of Auschwitz is indescribable. I mean, it was just the selections where we went outside. We had to take our one piece of clothing off, set it next to us, and stand up in straight lines, which was, of course, very important, always straight lines. And then we started asking the girls, what is selections? What do you mean selections? They said, well, Dr. Mengele and other SS women come, they point at you and they select you for the gas chamber. Well, we didn't know what they were talking about. They told us that there's a shower room with a shower head, and that's where people are told that they're going to take a shower, and that's when they go inside this room. And when they realize that there's no place for the water to run down, they panic. And it was all figured out very well. That's when they released the gas. And because they panicked, they inhaled it much faster. We used to be fed in the beginning with a bucket of soup. 10 of us had to drink a sip and pass it on. And on my birthday, the 7th of June, the first day there, we're standing split naked waiting for my soup. And my mother, in her most cheerful voice, says, "Today's your birthday, and I have a birthday present for you," she said. And I thought, what is she talking about? She says, "Today you can have my sip of soup as a birthday present." The slightest sign of not being well, they did away with you. My mother had a toothache and her face swelled up, and at that time they wanted to do very fast with a lot of people. So what they did is they put them on a boat, tied 10 of them together, and had them stand up at the edge of the boat and use only one bullet, and they fell into the sea. But otherwise, I didn't find out anything else what happened to any of my relatives.
At the end of the war, the world still celebrating, Allied forces in Germany uncover one bone-chilling tragedy after another.
I remembered one thing. My mother I always used to be very bicycling and hiking and all that, and I used to have always all kinds of wounds, and she used to put that horrible red iodine on it and blow and say it's only going to hurt until a scab grows over it. And this is what I thought of, that I have a wound, and I have to see to it that I have a scab grow over it.
World War II may have ended, but with tensions rising between Western nations and their former ally Russia, a new war came to take its place, the Cold War. In West Germany, the Marshall Plan is enacted to provide food and relief to the devastated country. For the Americans, it's a gesture of goodwill and precaution. They don't want economic misery to breed a new tyrant in Germany. But the Soviets have started to turn the liberation forces of Eastern Europe into occupational armies. Stalin rejects American aid in areas under his control. Fearing that a ring of new, well-fed democracies might encircle Russia, he clamps down even tighter, prompting Winston Churchill to make his famous speech.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals.
Behind this iron curtain, Russia holds East Germany in a stranglehold. The dividing line that runs through the capital of Berlin is a stark reminder of the differences in Soviet and American policy. While the citizens of Berlin are starving, Stalin claims that the roads are in need of repair, creating a blockade to American relief efforts. Short of military intervention, there's not much that can be done, except for one daring plan, a round-the-clock airlift of food and supplies flown over the Iron Curtain. Pilots and crews work feverishly, with the goal of landing one plane load of goods every 48 seconds. Once mortal enemies of the Germans, British and American pilots now drop handfuls of candy to the hungry children of Berlin. Winston Churchill calls it the most unsorted act in history. In Japan, MacArthur is busy restructuring the country and installing a constitutional democracy. Americans help the Japanese to rebuild their steel and automotive industries and teach them the methods of production that were so instrumental to the American war effort. In China, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek are already grappling for power. And in the destabilized nation of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is gathering strength. In the wake of World War II, the new enemy of Western democracy takes the form of a political ideology, communism. But the tension that builds around the new conflict is not merely political. As exemplified in Berlin, there are very real and powerful armies poised on either side of this Cold War, both living under the fear of the worst specter of World War II, the atomic bomb. Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Hirohito, and FDR. These were the men who shaped the second part of the 20th century. Their visions, whether constructive or destructive, shaped their time and the times we now live in. Thank you for joining us for our look at the great moments of the 20th century. I'm Laura McKenzie.